Okay. Now the mic is also on, so I don't need to yell. That's excellent. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm very excited, actually, to welcome you here and to talk about a topic which is really, really important. It's built to last, ultra-efficient and renewable-powered cities. Now, buildings account for more than half of C40 emissions. C40 cities emissions, and on average. And it is very clear that there is a need for urgent action here. And for this reason, actually, we do have some leading C40 cities which have signed the Net Zero Carbon Building Declaration, committing to use regulation and planning policies to really address this topic of emissions in the building sector. And in this declaration, actually the objective is that by 2030, new buildings will operate at a net zero carbon. And by 2050, not only new buildings, but all buildings. So this is really an ambition which is quite important if we're really serious about addressing climate change, the Paris Agreement. But as we'll also hear later, also addressing sustainable development goals. Now we have very exciting panel here and keynote speakers. We'll hear from three signatories of this declaration, what the drivers are, what they're doing, and what the opportunities and challenges are. But before going to the panel discussion, we will learn about the benefits actually of really investing in zero carbon emission buildings for the residents and also for businesses, because obviously to make this transition happen, it cannot only be driven by the policy side, but we do need the citizens, we do need the private sector, we do need technological solutions. And we will hear how making building ultra efficient and supplied by renewable energy can really also basically be a driver for these players and serve the citizens in the cities. We'll learn more about technology trends because technological solutions are important. And to start with, actually, I would like to introduce you to Jens Birgersson. I hope that I pronounced this correctly, who's the president and CEO of Rockwool. And he will introduce the new research into the benefits and deep retrofits, which is a technological solution where Rockwool is basically supporting to make things happen. Jens, please join me here.
So ladies and gentlemen, pleasure to be here. I really gonna try to not come across as a sneaky corporate guy. I've done this speech for almost 5 years now, and we have added the data, and I hope this is one of the last times that I speak about the case for renovation and taking care of the buildings. And a lot of progress have been made on the awareness. People say, that we heard it this morning, that we know the what, and I would say we know the what's. But as always in business, and when you drive a city or something else, there are a lot of what's, and at the end you need to pick your focus areas and you do it and implement it. And that's what going to define the success and the impact, to implement things with impact. And in my case, it's clear what the number one priority is. So we see in this slide, energy efficiency plays a key role in reducing carbon emissions. And energy efficiency is a bit of an abstract term, but it means something very, very simple. And that is that we need to use less. I mean, we look at this 2.0 degree, 2 degree scenarios and 1.5 degree scenario, and you look at the current trajectory, you have 7.7 billion people on the planet. It's going to be a big miss. It's going to be a big miss if we don't do something. And in the IPCC report, it concludes a couple of different calculations that 42% of emission reduction need to come from energy efficiency. So that's a focus area. But when you then look into that and any sustainability strategy that you can have, there are a couple of tiers of it. First of it is use less, green the rest, renewables, biogas, wind, and then address climate hazards, climate risks. Those are the things that you need to look into. And my point is that everywhere you look at it, with a planet with 7.7 billion people, using less is the first strategy, is the top strategy. But how do you use less? How do you use less? Do you do that, for example, in your house by reducing the temperature inside in the winter to 16 degrees C or 61 Fahrenheit in the winter? Do you do it by drinking warm beer? Do you do it by eating vegetarian every day if you like steak and fish? Or do you do it by having a hot apartment in the summer, maybe 34 degrees C, or have an apartment in the 90s? You could, of course, do that, but it's going to take an awful lot of convincing to get people to do that. And so in the IPC report, you also look into, and here's where the no-brainer come in from my perspective. If you spend $100 on investing it into getting rid of tons of CO2, the return on the investment from a planetary perspective, you take an amount of money with today's carbon prices, with today's labor prices you invested, you get roughly 70% more saving if you invest it in the built environment we have. You improve the energy efficiency in the buildings we have. It pays off from a planetary perspective 70% better, 68%. But it doesn't happen. Around the world, the trend is it's still cheaper to tear a building down, and it's still much easier to tear a building down, but to renovate it and improve the energy efficiency of a building it doesn't happen. About 1%. The pace of every building in 100 years we're going to renovate. So I think this is an incredibly important conclusion. So what we have done together with C40 and BuroHappold here and some of the partners, and I would come to that, is to try to say how can we sum up the planetary perspective in a tool, and I come back to that. But before I talk a bit more about benefits, what happens then if you do this? One side effect, and I would say that's a near intangible benefit from the corporate world, because we don't get it into a spreadsheet, is that today 91% of people in the cities live in an air quality climate in a city that is below the recommended standard. If you fix the buildings, this problem will go away. Yeah? Second fact we can also look at today in the built environment is that the buildings, we saw Toronto, 52% of the greenhouse gases comes from the built environment, but globally the buildings generate more than 30% of the CO2, the greenhouse gases, and it produces 1/3 of the waste, 1/3 of the waste. And when you look at, for example, our product, we emit some SOx, we emit some NOx when we produce it. We do, because we have an industrial process, but the payback is 100 to 4,000 times. So you need to do it in a green way, but the technology is there to make the materials, the technology, everything is in place to renovate building and to fix this problem and increase the energy efficiency. It's just a matter of doing it. Another reflection on this aspect is that today, over the last 200 years, we made buildings for 7.7 billion people. 97% of the buildings in Europe, they're below the standard we need. 97%. So we have two challenges. One is to fix the buildings we have that emit 1/3 of the CO2, but it's also to avoid in the next 50 years, where we probably build as many buildings as we did the last 200 years, to repeat the mistake. And I think those two are two big threats, but the awareness is there, and we just need to nail it on both sides and not make the mistake. Another, I think this is a bit of a surprising picture. We talk about the OECD countries and the non-OECD countries. In Europe, 15% of all the people, that's 125 million people, suffer fuel poverty. They can't heat their apartment in the winter enough. So it is a problem also in the OECD countries that we have fuel poverty. So it's a quality aspect to this also when you run a city to sort it out. And then a small contribution to the solution. From a technical perspective, everything exists to do this. These are all tested methodologies. Insulation materials are available that are possible to recycle. We know the technology how to do it, but we need to do it in cities. It has to happen in cities. And there are real people in the buildings. There are voters in the buildings. It's difficult to do because the cities are 24/7 active, and there is a shortage of housing in many places, so you can't move people around, so you need to do it while people are in it. So what we did here is that together with University College of London, BuroHappold, and C40, some people in this room helped to work on the tool, and also with some pilots in Copenhagen, Milano, and New York. We created a tool where we looked into not only the monetary payback, the net present value of the same maintenance and energy cost, but also into the other aspects, so like productivity, job creation, energy poverty, cold mortality, and health issues. And we tried to put that together in one calculation. And then in 10 years, I have no doubt that CO2 and other CO2 pricing, maybe energy pricing, many of these economic factors have come together so that you get a clean economic payback. But today you don't always have that. So you need to look at the whole picture when you do your legislation or regulation, or perhaps renovate what you can, hospitals, schools. And this tool helps to give this picture for the planetary and economic impact. So from my perspective, it's a small contribution, but I would like to thank our partners for having worked on this. Until the economics proves every case, you need to put it together so that people see the real impact, and that we have attempted to do with this tool. And I very much look forward to see if we can change behaviors and get renovation really going over the next decade of action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jens, for this overview. And I'm inviting Sarah, our next keynote speaker, Sarah Prichard, who's the UK Managing Director of BuroHappold Engineering. And she will give us an overview about zero carbon building and how they look like. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. We all want to live in homes that are healthy, comfortable, easy to run, and low carbon. It should be something that everyone in this room can relate to. Half of Britain's energy use and carbon emissions are associated with our buildings. Whilst we talk about renewable energy and greening the grid, we actually need, as Jens has just said, to reduce energy usage in order to achieve a zero carbon future. Our moral compass and building regulations require us to think about low carbon solutions in new buildings, but we also need to improve the energy efficiency of existing properties as well. Commercial and civic buildings, their owners are actively working to reduce energy levels, but domestic properties are lagging behind. In publicly owned housing, there's been significant improvement and progress towards zero carbon. Local government, led by mayors such as yourselves, have had a direct influence promoting leading, legislating, and then acting. If we're going to shift the dial towards zero carbon, we need to help private owners also retrofit their properties. Why aren't we doing this instinctively? The number of electric and hybrid vehicles is doubling each year, but houses just seem to be less exciting. How can we change this and make it easy and straightforward to retrofit private dwellings and move towards zero carbon? What does zero carbon housing look like? It's all about energy efficiency. The walls, windows and roofs are insulated to reduce heat gain and loss and to improve air tightness. Heating, lighting and ventilation systems deliver comfort efficiently and recover heat or coolth to reduce the amount of energy needed overall. Heat pumps, which push the energy around, or the heating or cooling around the house, are powered by zero carbon electricity. All appliances are energy efficient, and energy is generated cleanly and renewably on site using wind or solar photovoltaics. Any residual use of fossil fuels is offset through an accredited scheme. Smart controls and battery storage allows users to match supply and demand and to reduce their overall energy use. And overall performance is monitored so that occupiers can make effective low-carbon choices. None of this is rocket science, of course. It's all reasonably obvious and straightforward. Most homeowners can understand that these houses are efficient to run and pleasant to live in. Designing and constructing new buildings for zero carbon is comparatively easy, and there are good examples of residential developments that have done this. The Future Energy House, built by Berkeley Homes in London, is a 3-storey townhouse which includes renewable sources such as photovoltaics and battery storage. It helps cut energy bills and put pressure on the power grid at times of peak demand. Clearly, it should be better to live in, save owners money, and reduce their carbon footprint. Berkeley Homes are hoping that all of their new build developments will be net zero carbon in operation from 2030, and are working to understand how homeowners use these facilities and engage with this technology so they can roll it out more extensively. 80% of 2050's residential buildings have already been built. It's essential, therefore, that we tackle the existing stock, and this is much more challenging than new builds. The Thamesmead estate in southeast London is typical of post-war housing that you can find all over Europe. Dating from the 1960s, this 4-bedroom property had poor levels of energy efficiency and was cold and damp due to old leaky windows and uninsulated fabric. It was also expensive to run. Peabody Trust carried out a deep energy retrofit on a single property to prove the concept. This included externally insulating walls, roofs and floors, new triple glazing and energy-efficient doors, high levels of air tightness, and a range of solar technologies, including photovoltaics and solar water heating. All of this needed a step change in workmanship. Post-occupancy evaluation showed that there was a wide range of benefit, including an 80% reduction in carbon emissions, improved thermal efficiency, and lower energy bills. The energy efficiency of English homes has increased considerably over the last 20 years. Socially owned houses outperform those of owner-occupiers as this sector is implementing the necessary changes. However, 80% of the housing stock is privately owned. 3/4 have undergone one energy upgrade in the last 5 years, improving boilers or insulation, but it's going to need extensive leadership, legislation and incentives to achieve a deep energy retrofit in the sector. It adds value to the owners, both in use and at the time of sale. We need to consider direct assistance with upfront costs, such as grants or loans, as well as indirect measures, such as information dissemination regulation. City leaders can also improve the supply side, finding installers to support retrofit activity, whilst improving local employment and engagement. But if we're to successfully tackle the climate emergency, we need to be able to show it's possible to move towards zero carbon homes globally. The Masdar Eco Villa in Abu Dhabi has been designed to consume 1/3 of the energy of a normal villa and it also creates this energy using solar power. In New York City, the house at Cornell Tech University is the world's first tall residential building to receive a Passive House accreditation. Its super insulation has resulted in very low energy in operation. These and many other examples provide the global leadership we all need as we work towards delivering net zero carbon homes. It is possible, it's far from rocket science, and it's something we all need to get behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think this is exciting to hear that the technologies and the solutions do exist. I think we can make it happen. I'm going to change my hat now because I will take 5 minutes to introduce myself because I forgot to do this in the beginning. Rana Adib. I'm the Executive Secretary of REN21, the Renewable Energy Pulse Network for the 21st Century. And I'm quickly going to give you a quick overview about what the situation is in renewable energy, because we heard very much about efficiency, how to bring things together, and quickly see what the situation is on renewable energy. So very quickly, we're doing knowledge to inform decision makers and create debates. And I think that's really exciting to be here. And we're doing this as a network of multi-stakeholder groups. And this is really what REN21 is also doing, is bridging basically the renewable energy into the cities discussion, because the energy discussion is not always in all cities worldwide on the top of the agenda. But cities are, this is what we observe, not always on the top of the agenda in the energy debate. So we're also inviting you over into the global energy debate. Quickly, where do we stand when we look at renewable energy? We see that much is happening in the power sector. You see it here. These are the installed capacities. And actually, the revolution in the renewable sector is really driven very much by solar photovoltaics and wind energy. And this also explains why, when we're talking about the building sector, so about heating and cooling, but also the transport sector, we clearly see from the transport side a real push for electrification. This is coming very much when we're coming from the generation side. The situation, however, and I think that's something which is extremely important, when we're looking into the share of electricity consumption in the overall energy consumption, electricity only represents 17%. And here we have 26% of renewable energy. Over 50% occurs in heating and cooling, so in the building sector and in industries, and over 30% in the transport sector. And here we respectively only have 10% of renewable energy share and 3% in the transport sector. So what is the message here? Very clearly, bringing down the demand, so I think it's consuming less, and then developing the solutions which need to be developed to cover this with renewable energy. Now, what is important to see here, the balance below shows how important policy and regulation is to drive this. If we do have the uptake in the power sector, it is because there was, for a long time, attention of policymakers, regulators, to really support the renewable in the power sector, bring in the industry, develop technologies, bring down costs. And we do see in the heating sector, which is relevant for the discussion here, that only 20 countries at the national level basically address the sector. Now, why is that? There are probably many reasons for this, but one reason clearly is when we're looking into these sectors, these are end-use sectors which are not global markets. We typically don't have global players here. It is local markets. Very often we even don't really know what is really ongoing. And this is actually where this bridging into the cities world is fundamental. Because what is happening in the building sector is very much influenced and driven by what municipalities are also putting in place, supporting, and the orientation which is given. To support this, actually, and we have a C40 is on the advisory committee of this activity, we have started a report, reporting on the status of renewable energy in cities worldwide, because we really see that there needs to be more consolidated information on what is happening here to bridge basically the debate between the national and the global debate and what is happening at the city municipal level. Because cities are key drivers in making the transition happen in this energy sector. Now, we heard about the building obligations for existing buildings and new buildings. What is very clear here from this map shows the mandates, the countries which have mandatory building energy codes. And you see that there are not many countries, or that there are still many countries where there is still a gap. I think according to IEA, for instance, when we're looking into energy efficiency, 70% of the buildings do not have a regulation, actually, of the existing building stock. So this is why, and now I'm leading over again to the panel, because we clearly see that cities, municipalities do have a regulatory role and in power also to really complement what is not happening at the national level. So I'm switching my hat again, and I'm very happy to invite my dear panelists from the cities to join me here. Jenny Durkan, who is the mayor of Seattle. Hello, Jenny. Eckart, Wuzner, who is the mayor of Heidelberg. And Stevens Mokgalapa, I hope I pronounce it correctly, mayor from Tshwane. Thank you very much. Sorry? No? So I think we have now the mayors who will complement or comment basically on what we heard during the keynotes. So to start with, I would actually like to ask the same question to all of you, because I think what we do see very clearly is there is a fundamental role of addressing buildings and the CO2 emissions in buildings to really reach our targets. However, when it comes to the reality, we still see that very often city lanes and electric mobility, for instance, seems to be much more prominent and also raise more interest, visibility on the citizen side. So I would be really curious to hear what on the Seattle side, for instance, you are doing specifically to overcome this perceptual barrier and raise the interest of citizens in be excited about buildings.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you all for being here. So we found in Seattle, we're at the point now where we don't think it should be an or. We can't do transportation or buildings. We have to do an and. And so in the building sector, we're trying to do a variety of things, both incentives and regulations, to see how we do it. And we're also trying to get better data, because I think if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so, for example, if you look at our building sectors, we're seeing, for example, that we still had a significant number of our residents, a small portion compared to overall, that were reliant on home heating oil. But it accounted for almost 18% of the carbon emissions in our residential sector. And so if we could go to that and really make a change, we knew we could start moving the dial. So we implemented a new tax. We proposed and implemented a tax that we think will bring down the use of that, but we're using that tax to actually convert those homes to clean energy. So there's an example of how we're both trying to change the structure. We know that it falls on those who sometimes have the lowest incomes or fixed incomes, because they're still reliant on that. They can't afford to convert, so we implement the tax in a way that we actually then can get them to convert. We also are using a number of tools, both incentives and regulations, to get our building sector to be more energy efficient and to also get them to be carbon neutral or not use carbon at all. So we launched a Living Building Challenge, where as an incentive we would give developers and builders additional floor space or height in return if they agree to certain requirements, like being a living building, so using eco-friendly materials, not using carbon, and actually reducing the amount of emissions. We also, for our large commercial buildings, require them to do a tune-up every summer number of years to measure how they're doing, and then that leads them to making improvements and retrofits. And so we have found over the range of tools we've had that we've done better in our building sector. But like you point out, transportation is such a high accounting for it that people focus on that. But we found with focusing on buildings, we can actually make a difference. We ran into a little bit of a conflict because we were so quickly able in the residential sector to get people to be more efficient that energy consumption went down. But because we own our own utility, it made their rates go up. And so we had to explain to people, the less you use, the more you pay. And so we also now are looking to our utility to change our business model to really have it, because we own our own electric company. It's a clean grid because it's hydropower. So to use that as a business model for now electrifying our own transportation fleet, and to do that to offset the cost to residents.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. What about Tshwane? So how do you make a building and addressing CO2 emissions in buildings relevant to your people?
Yeah, most certainly. I think as the city of Tshwane, we have been doing this for a long time. As early as 2012, we had our green building bylaws, and we are now in a process where we are going to be reviewing that bylaw to ensure that it complies with the modern challenges of climate change. We have done our green house inventory, gas inventory as well, just to get a sense in terms of where are we in terms of the emissions. And I think us being the signatory, of net zero, carbon emission, I think it gives us that trajectory where we can be able to improve our systems into how do we ensure development in our city. But as you know, that always being a mayor, it's a balancing act between ensuring development and on the other side, ensuring that there is compliance to issues and response to issues around climate change. So what we have done is, apart from ensuring that we have the green building bylaw, our own headquarters, it's 100% compliant. In terms of green, it's a green office, and we are working with the private sector to ensure that they comply and we have a buy-in, because usually these things always work better when you have a buy-in from the private sector. So we have established the Green Building Forum, which is spearheaded by myself as the mayor together with the private property developers. Further to that, we are launching a solar PV system within our own municipal buildings so that we can ensure that we are energy efficient. We are now in a process where we are looking for PPPs in terms of our energy mix. We are crafting a energy mix policy focusing on embedded generation so that we can make it more cleaner and more efficient and more effective. But the challenges, obviously, of electrification is insurmountable. So which means that as a city, we got to ensure that we provide electrification in a more clean and sustainable manner. So from the transport side, we have about 40 fleet of buses who are using CNG. We are the city that has got the first of the CNG depot within the sub-Saharan Africa. We've got 3 stations of electric car chargers. We've got 10 electric vehicles for each of our 10 departments. and we are looking at getting even more. So those are some of the things that we are doing to ensure that we mitigate. We are now also, together with the C40 Finance, we are working on a project for walkways and cycle lanes so that we can also mitigate in terms of emissions in our roads. So not only cycling is a health issue, but it also a climate change issue because of it assists. It's just an attitude change that people can get used to it. So those are the mechanisms that we are putting together to ensure, firstly, that we have green buildings in terms of our property development and as well as from the transport side in making sure that we use less emissions.
Thank you very much. Let's move to Europe. So what is Heidelberg doing so that your citizens get excited about addressing CO2 in buildings?
I think we have the same problem like we have this here in the room. When I just ask you, what are you thinking about tiny houses? Please raise your hand if you think this is a good idea. Tiny housing. Okay, plastic ban. Raise your hand. Okay, who is for efficient building from 180 kilowatt hours to about 15 kilowatt hours? Raise your hand. I think this is the problem. Because when I talk to engineers and people who have the knowledge what's about it, you get the acceptance for those programs. But if you go to the citizens, you have a totally misunderstanding about priorities and where we have to work. So we all have to start with retrofitting programs, thinking about more efficient buildings. I would say not using less. I always try to tell about, please use your brain. Yeah. So intelligent building is the message. And if you talk to people, nobody wants to throw out money out of the window if they have a good technical solution. And that's what we have done. So if you try to work with citizens, you first have to start with the best practice example. That's what we have done. Start with municipal buildings, start with schools, kindergartens. And about 30 years ago, no, 28 years ago, we started with the CO2 reduction programs in the city of Heidelberg. I was setting up these programs together with my team. And one of the main messages at that time was retrofitting. Since that time, we really have implemented a huge plan as an environment commissioner, as an environmental mayor, now as the mayor of the city, to implement those programs. And this was a long process. Since 10 years, for example, we decided we just built 100% CO2-free buildings, new buildings, 10 years ago. Also new city areas, 100% zero-emission buildings, not only buying green energy and less efficient buildings, I mean super efficient buildings. Everybody has to build this, not just as an example. When you do this, you noticed, okay, it's getting quite complicated because you find no architects who can follow up with these technical solutions. So we started huge architect education programs. Our standard was mostly about 10% of the national standard, 15% of the national standard. So our buildings are using about 15 kilowatt hours per square meter in a year, the new buildings. The national standard was 75. The normal building is about 180 to 200. So from 200 liters oil per square meter in a year to 1.5 liter. That's the technical potential available on the market already 10 years ago. So that's what we have done, building in Germany the first zero-emission fire brigade, the first zero-emission kindergarten, and so on and so on. The retrofitting part was much more complicated because there you have to show what you can do in existing buildings. Our biggest problem was no money for such a huge investment because you're talking about millions you need. For retrofitting a building which is existing, why should you spend so much money as a politician in such a building if you get more applause if you build a new kindergarten or you build a new power plant on solar? So you have to really get the acceptance. No, we have to retrofit. That's very important. That's the first step. That's what we have done by huge investment by private companies through energy contracts. So we spend not more money, we just use intelligent the money from private companies who makes the whole retrofit. We make a contract. After 6 years, they get the payback for their investment. We make a plus of 2 years, so they had a good investment, get their money, and we have from the first year on new super efficient buildings, isolated, new lightings and so on. For the private, we noticed we have to give them money. So we started with a plus investment program for them. Give them €5 per inhabitant is now a special city budget for retrofitting programs. This helps a lot to get them mobilized, give them free energy advice through an energy agency to help them to come over, to raise the rate from 1% retrofitting to 3% retrofitting. And the main message was, it is the biggest employment program. It is the biggest employment program because it has a lot to do with craft and trade people who are working locally. So it's you make a huge program for the local business. It's all local business, and this creates a new economy, the green economy we were talking about. Yeah, it's nearly based on this technology. It's not the big wind power plant. Still, they are very important, but you use not so much people to get them built. It's a retrofitting program, and that's the way we work, and that's the way we produce about 50% of all the energy demand of all buildings in the city by the last 10 years, and building now globally, I think with the Bahnstadt, globally the biggest zero-emission city, a whole city zero emission. A 15 kilowatt hour per square meter is the heat demand. The rest of the energy we need, we produce in the new power plant we build based on renewables. So this is then an intelligent whole new city concept.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is very comprehensive experience here we have heard, and what I hear already is communication, making things relevant, moving from something abstract to something which is concrete and relevant, and where citizens can also engage with, is fundamental. The other part, I think all three of you build on basically business models also to some extent, so the utility which is owned by the city, for instance, and interesting leverages here. Now, Mr. Mokgalapa, I'm sorry, I tried to train before, but may I say Stevens? Thank you so much. That's much easier. So, your city has been a founding signatory of the Net Zero Carbon Building Declaration, and with many other C40 South African cities. And it seems like leadership is also coming from Global South with regard to that. So I would like to understand how you see the city's role basically in driving this ultra-efficient building powered by renewables, at the interface between the national context and the city's context. Because I think I've shown the national situation here, and we see that there is a real question on how the integration works.
I think the most important thing to put across in terms of mitigating climate change issues, it's a question of collaboration and cooperation. Not only from local government, but also from the private sector and from national government. Now, in South Africa, we've got what we call the National Development Plan, which is more like a prototype plan for the whole country. And one of the chapters just focus specifically on building sustainable cities and building resilient cities. So this is where we tap in terms of that collaboration between national government and ourselves as local government. Now, ever since us being the signatory of the net zero carbon emissions, I think we have played a very much significant role. And I think furthermore, talking about collaboration, it's not only about looking at the South. Yes, we've got development challenges in the South. We are rapidly growing, having in-migration into our urban centers, but it's the same to any other cities also in the North. And I think I've got two of my North friends here, from the US and from Germany. So it's a collaboration in terms of how we need to work together, both the South and the North, though the challenges might might be different in terms of what we have to do, because we need development, we need economic growth, we need jobs. While on the north, you might be needing something else that is more sustainable moving forward, because you already have got those basics. But we are still at the level where we still have to get basics right. So that is our focal point and our departure point. So apart from having this green building bylaw, as I said, we also had a forum where we are engaging with the potential developers moving forward, and also within our own regulatory framework, because as a city, you've got the powers for regulation and for guiding development. And that is where we are making sure that our city planning, our housing, and as well as our utilities are very much climate resilient and climate smart in how we envision development moving forward, because you can no longer have just development for the sake of it. It must be smart, it must be climate resilient, it must be forward-looking, but it's more about making sure that we are pragmatic in that approach as well. So this is what we have been doing. We are part of the C40 new building program, which also assists us in terms of the technical aspects of how do we ensure that our development and our private property development moving forward is climate resilient and respond to the issues around climate change. So it is collaboration, both from north and south, collaboration both local and national, and collaboration both government and private sector.
Let me maybe quickly build on this. Are there situations where the national regulatory framework represents a barrier for local action?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there is always, will be that tension in terms of the regulatory barriers between national and local government, because we are dealing with different competing interests. Mainly national government is about policy, but local government is about implementation, because of that is where things happen. So at some point you might find that you've got two competing things. An example that I would give you is what we call a PI Act in South Africa. It's Prevention of Illegal Eviction Act, which says that if a person invades a particular portion of land or house or building and you don't remove them within 24 hours, when you go and want a court order, you got to provide them an alternative accommodation, irrespective. Now, that brings a challenge to us in local government, because we are custodian of the land. Most of the land within our jurisdiction is owned by the city. You have some which is owned by provincial government, some which is owned by national government. So that is where the contestation is, because of then it creates informal settlements. We have 210 informal settlements in Tshwane, which means a serious burden on our budgeting and our planning, because we got to provide unplanned and unbudgeted services. Because of once people invade a particular portion of land, then it means you got to provide those basic services, water, sanitation, and electricity. So it is where you might find that contestation in terms of policy and legislation. But in the main, relevant to what we are doing in climate change, there is synergy in terms of the National Development Plan, Chapter 5, which is talking about building sustainable cities.
Okay, thank you very much. Coming back to Seattle, you have mentioned that you're doing incentives and regulation. When we are looking globally to drive energy efficiency, regulation is really a key tool. There is always this question on what is a balance between incentivizing and regulating, imposing obligations. What is your take on that?
I think you have to do both. I think that you have to impose some regulations to set a bar, but then you have to incent so that private industry gets into the game and has an incentive to do it. Because government just can't scale quickly enough to retrofit all these buildings that we need to retrofit. I also, listening to my panelists here, think, we tend to think of transportation sector, building sector, how do we do it? We're learning that we have to be much more holistic. So for example, our building codes now, we just implemented a law that requires in new buildings there to be infrastructure for charging electric vehicles. So we're thinking not only about how does that building more efficiency, but how does that contribute to the overall thing? The other thing is, it's not just how does each building, how does it contribute, but where are we building? And we're learning in Seattle that we needed density quickly. We needed more people to be able to live affordably where they work. And to get around. So we are adding density quickly. We just did a big upzone citywide that will help that. We also know that we've got to build it around transit. So we're really focused, hyper-focused on building affordable housing around our transit centers so that not only is it how we build and how efficient it is, but where it is, so that people don't have to get into cars to get to work. They can get on transit, or they can walk, or they can bike. And if you have all of that working together, I think that's the only way we can actually meet the goals that we all have set.
Maybe if you allow me to build on this again, because yes, integration is very important, and we need to have a more holistic approach. Historically, we are not very much used to do this. So what are you doing in Seattle to drive this bridging between sectors, more integrated planning, policy design?
I think we're fortunate in some ways because Seattle is growing so rapidly now. We're one of the fastest growing cities, so we had to really be very intentional about how do we grow. And we also grown so quickly that so many people have been displaced that we needed affordable housing. We're also investing in infrastructure for a new light rail system that's costing billions of dollars. So how do we make sure that when we do that, we're going to leverage that benefit for as many people as possible and get us closer, not just so people can use it, but they can live around the transit centers. We also, I'm very fortunate, I've got a very progressive city council, one of them who's here, who's been a leader on climate actions for a long time, who's been in this space thinking, how do we have holistic solutions, and not just for our city, but for our region, because everyone knows that cities can't just act one by one. If we don't act in concert together in a region, then we won't meet the goals that we have.
Thank you so much. Coming back to Heidelberg. So, first of all, congratulations to become become one of the newest signatories, actually, of the declaration. We heard before that you have a lot of experience already, so I think it's very good to underline this by this. Now, there is the region of Barnstadt, where you have basically asked a whole new development to meet the demand of passive house standards. It would be really interesting to better understand what extra programs and incentives you have put in place specifically to really make not only one house but a whole area happen, and also how did stakeholders respond to this demand?
Yeah, I try to give you some ideas what we have done, and I want to just make some comments to Jenny, because it's exactly what we have to do, not thinking about houses, we have to think about city development, regional development, based on the new mobility system, tracks. Yeah, everything along the tracks, raise the leverage of the buildings from the flats, so 2, 3, 4 storages is normal, also in a city like Heidelberg, where normally we just build 1 or 2 storage buildings in the past years. So you have to think about density, you have to think about the good mobility connection, and you have to show how huge areas, especially for growing cities, also like Heidelberg is a very expanding city at the moment, and which tools do you have. And we noticed that, of course, if we just have ideas of a good city plan, we can't implement our city ideas if we are not the owner of the land. So what we have done is becoming the biggest landowner ever. So I buy every area I can buy. And there is no development without the ownership of the city. Because through this was the example of the Barnstadt, We could not talk to companies, not ask citizens or new citizens to accept our standard. They just get the ground if they accept the Heidelberg standard. And the Heidelberg standard, still 10 years after implementation, is not the national standard today. So thinking about the gap. This means if anybody wants to live in Heidelberg, they have to accept the sustainable standards of the city. And this means bicycle lane, this means green roof tops, nearly 100% rainwater drainage in your garden for all the water is coming in, so it's a sustainable concept of the whole new city area. With a new tram, which is integrated into the concept, and also every building 100% zero efficient building. But we only made it because we were the landowner. And this is, I think, very important for cities to accept no development without ownership, because then you're totally independent from national or supranational standard, which are far away from the technical standard, and far away from the political standard we set when we're talking about CO2 emissions. The gap, we have to work on it, on our national leaders summits and all of this, but locally you have to think about your tools. And I think this was the way we have done this. This area is about, this new city area is about 100 football stadiums size, about all 4 or 5 storages. More than 10,000 people are living in 10 years. The costs were higher, you have to say this. It's about 3 to 4% higher costs, but the buildings were excellent. And the energy demand is about 15% of the national energy demand. So everybody was going in, also affordable. Now I come to the point, affordable means the citizens are just interested what they have to pay for the flat, not for the energy consumption and for the second flat rate, we call them in Germany. So they just are interested what's the cold flat rate and what's the warm flat rate. And if you combine them, you noticed, hey, these buildings are getting cheaper than the stupid buildings. So it makes sense. The only problem is that the building constructors have no interest. Why? They are building and selling. If they keep being the partner for 10, 15, 20 years to rent the flat, they have an interest. That's our city company. Yeah, our city building company has a big interest, energy efficient. The other company is not. So you have to say that you have to accept this standard. And we stopped the discussion just to try to get everybody on board. It takes too long. But on the other hand, we have an incentive program also to help them to overcome these 3 to 4% higher costs. So we have a special program where everybody gets, for example, 15 euro per square meter retrofitting. 15 euro per square meter cash money. Cash money. That's very important, because normally on a bank you get very good credits at the moment, but you get no cash money. This helps a lot, especially also for the old parts of the city, to bring them thinking about, oh, there is money from the city, I can think about new windows or new retrofitting. This helps a lot. So this is a little bit the story of the Bahnstadt.
Where did you get the revenues to buy the land?
From the bank. From the bank. So what we have done is we created a new association of, we have the situation that in Germany you have, the mayor is the head of the city bank. So we have an own bank, which is responsible for about 70% of all the credits for companies. So you have an income. And with the city bank, with the city building company, and with the state company for buildings, we create a new company who has enough money to own all these areas, but under the legal frame of the city. And this was the way we buy the land to get in the position to be a new landlord. But I think it's absolutely important to be the landlord. Otherwise, you too many handling with contracts which are mostly not super efficient, mostly a little bit efficient.
I'm going to echo this back because the fact that you asked where did you get the money from. So what is the situation in Seattle? Is this something, because ownership seems to be really fundamental, whether it is land, the utility, the buildings, is this something which would be an option to buy the land?
We actually own a lot of land, but we're always looking to do that for the reasons that the mayor has outlined. Because if the city owns the land, then you can control more what goes there. We're using city-owned land to build affordable housing as much as we can. We just had a new law passed that enabled us to give city-owned land to nonprofits if they agree to build affordable housing. And we're trying to do that in high-opportunity neighborhoods. But the more land we have available, we can do that. The other thing we're finding is that as we get more density, we're having a hard time keeping the open space and public realm, which everyone knows is important, not just for livability, but for climate. And I think that's a thing for growing cities to really keep an eye on, because it is, because there's so much pressures for people to live in the city at an affordable rate, and so much profit to be made, that keeping that green space really takes intentional action.
Thank you so much. I think I'm looking to my colleagues. We're coming to the end. So a quick wrap-up. I think the second round really brought in the part of integration. I think whether we're speaking about integration between efficiency, renewable energy, integration between the city, regional, national level, integration between the sectors. Ownership all over is very important and is key. I heard in all parts how important data is to inform decisions, to plan, but also the right tools to make the decisions. So the empowerment which is needed here. And I think one thing is very clear is if it's about bringing in all stakeholders and making these developments relative or relevant to the citizens, it's about making the communication less abstract, but about also perspectives. We heard job creation, we heard socioeconomic or economic development, social developments, and it's not about speaking about the kilowatt hour, but about the warm beer, which has convinced all of us, I think, that we do not want to drink warm beer. I would like to invite all of you to join me in thanking our panelists and our keynote speakers, and thank you very much for your attention. And I wish you a very good rest of the summit. Thank you.